What do you think goes into being a successful entrepreneur? What are the key ingredients?
I think my favorite saying recently has been, it's better to be lucky than good. But the truth behind that is that luck is also a function of putting yourself in the right place.
Well, I am excited. Welcome to the Walk On podcast. This is the 5th episode of season 1. For those who are just joining us, Walk On stands for, it's a lyric in the song, You'll Never Walk Alone. And the premise being, if you continue to put your head down, do the work and look up, there is light at the end of the tunnel and you'll figure out where you're going. And this podcast is about that for me, a journey to find my passion and what moves me. And today we're really lucky to have a guest on who's a wine enthusiast, 40 under 40 tastemaker, graduate from Harvard University, a member of their Glee Club, which we will definitely talk about, honored in 2023 by the New York Wine and Grape Foundation and his peers as the Phyllis Feeder Unity Award winner. And he's the co-chair of FLXcursion International Riesling Conference, which we'll talk about as well. Our guest, Kelby James Russell, owns and is launching Apollo's Praise. He's most known for his expertise in elevating the wine at Red Newt Cellars, Empire State, and the eponymous wine, Kelby James Russell. And he also is married to Julia Hoyle, who's the winemaker at Hosmer Winery. So keeping wine in the family. So with that, I'm going to bring on Kelby James Russell and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're glad you're here. I know this is a very busy time as both you're getting wine to market and starting the process of getting those next grapes into production. So why don't you go ahead and tell the folks a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I am somewhat rare in the Finger Lakes for being a native son that's in the wine industry. I think as the region has exploded in the last, I guess 50 years, you would say, but especially the last 25 or so, it's seen a lot of outside interest, a lot of expertise coming in from outside the region, which is incredible and has been really important and is a strong sign for it. But I grew up here and grew up in Newark, so just 20 minutes north of Geneva, and thought for sure that when I graduated high school, I had hit sort of like orbital escape velocity and going to Harvard, and which is not a typical path for someone from Newark, but going to Harvard, I would forever be on the East Coast in cities doing, whatever I thought I was going to be doing. But, life has a funny way of coming back around and bringing you back in. So.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I grew up in Rochester and went to Hobart and then lived in Atlanta for, at this point, almost half my life and moved back in 2016 and didn't recognize the place, right? You talked about all this outside influence. Growing up, you had these noteworthy wines, but I think Finger Lakes wine was known for something different than it is today. So why don't you help ground us and educate our viewers and guests about the Finger Lakes region?
Yeah, it's a topic I love talking about because the history of the region is actually really fascinating and much deeper than people expect. We think of, I think by default, because they've been popular for a while, we think of California wine as the sort of, the OGs of American wine. But in reality, the Finger Lakes had a booming wine industry through the mid-19th century. They were using native grapes. They were making sparkling wine in a champagne style that was, to say successful is an understatement. They were doing millions of cases a year coming out of these different wine cellars, especially on Keuka Lake. I think, as people might know, Hammondsport. One of my favorite pieces of American ingenuity from that period is they realized that on their label, so one, you could say champagne, that wasn't a protected term, but you could say bottled in, and you just had to name the post office. So all these small towns changed their post office names to like town names in Champagne. So it would say Champagne bottled in Rem or bottled in Epernay. Wow. But I think it's huge industry. Prohibition came, knocked that all back. A few big players still survived. And then the sort of modern wine region, in some ways you would say certainly that Dr. Frank's, that's a name a lot of people know. He came from Ukraine in the 50s and 60s and kind of really showed how you could grow the European grapes in this region. Herman Weimer, another pioneer in the 70s from Bernkastel in the Mosel, really passionate for Riesling, which was obviously a great fit for the climate. But you had finally in the late 70s, State Farm Act, Farm Winery Act, because up until that point, if you were a farmer of grapes, it was illegal basically to have your own winery. You had to go through the real
Still post-prohibition, that was a challenge.
Yeah. You had to, so if you wanted a winery, you had to have a commercial bonded winery, which is a massively expensive undertaking, even to this day, right? Like this is meant for the big Goliaths of the world.
Yep.
So the state allowed farm wineries to exist actually in response to a grape market crash, so that all these farmers didn't go out of business. And these farm wineries started to spring up. And that's kind of the era that certainly I grew up in. I feel like, a lot of people think of when they think of the Finger Lakes wine industry in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there were a lot of wineries and people were doing a good job. And you also had a lot of, farmer first generation wineries. And I don't think it's surprising that two things. One, these were people who knew how to grow grapes like the back of their hand, but winemaking was a new skill set that was getting thrown into the mix. So there had to be a professionalization of that. On the other hand, you did have a local consuming audience that was really supportive, but, there wasn't an inherent wine culture in the Finger Lakes at that point in a way that I think we do have one now, which is fascinating. But people, drink what they like, which is always important, but they were drinking the sort of gateway wines that I think a lot of us probably go through when we're getting into it. Sweeter wines, less expensive, and because there were so many tourists coming through your front doors and tasting room, the region kind of, correctly for a while responded to that economic incentive, really pumping out sweeter wines, expecting people to come and taste them in the tasting room, and that's kind of like in some ways, I guess you would say the first phase of the modern Finger Lakes wine industry. And then starting in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, you started to see a bit of a pivot. And I'm not even talking about quality of wine as much, because that had been on the up and up throughout. And obviously there were some great producers through everything. The quality was already increasing regardless. But I think you saw a bit of a business model pivot where wineries started to see that there was a market outside their tasting room door, which, is hard to sometimes see because you get full value for the wine when it's in your tasting room. But all of a sudden there was interest from distributors to sell the wine around New York State and beyond. And there was an audience larger than just the Finger Lakes. And now there's an export audience. And that shift certainly helped the business model of wineries. It's a change, but it also continued, as like a virtuous circle. It kind of inspired more people to hear about the Finger Lakes because the wines were getting further and further afield, which in turn just has more people come here because they want to take a stab at being part of the region as well. There's so many deeply entrenched wine regions, even on the West Coast, and we talk to our colleagues out there, and if they're, if you're a young out of college wine enthusiast, want to be a winemaker, you're going to spend 20 years kind of working in the trenches before you might get an assistant gig, which is, just the way it goes. There's a lot of money being thrown around out there. Whereas here, like if you're me, and it's still the case, 15 years on, you could show up on a crush pad during harvest, totally green as an intern. And, within a few years, it's a very meritocratic sort of place. If you put the work in and you have some talent, all of a sudden you'll find yourself as an assistant winemaker and kind of on that. So.
Yeah. Well, let's do that. Actually, that's a perfect segue back into how did you go from Harvard and Glee Club to a winemaker and an entrepreneur in the Finger Lakes? What is that personal arc for you?
I went to Harvard thinking initially that I was going to do nanotech. I thought that was I was very gifted with science and math in school. And then when I got to college, the reality is that most of my classmates had been on accelerator programs through their entire childhood. And that was not really a thing when I was growing up, which was totally fine. But it felt like I was going to be far behind in that world. Then I had this other passion. I had always been really passionate about music. I'd played saxophone all through school in Newark, had sung, had been in musicals, and fortunately landed in the Harvard Glee Club within my first couple of weeks on campus, which is...
Does one really land there, though, Kelby? I have to push back. I don't think you just land there.
No,
I think you
audition.
have to have talent.
Yeah. I mean, fortunately, I have a high tenor voice, so they're always looking for that. But yes, it is hard to get there. And I think people hear Glee Club and they think of the show now, which is great. But the Harvard Glee Club was a particular type of choir, all male voices, 60 voices, very serious sort of classical choral repertoire, Renaissance polyphony. We had a subgroup that I was also a part of that would do the sort of a cappella singing that people also associate with that name. So we covered both. But the main choir was professionally directed, really great conductor, but managed by the students. And it was very proudly managed by the students through its whole history, 150 years at that point. And a lot of those students had gone on into orchestra management, which is, I would say is a niche profession, but I'm a winemaker now. So it's,
sure,
niche to niche. But I managed the Glee Club during my, I started as the stage manager, which is like the grunt job that everyone starts with if you're interested, and then became the librarian, which is another sort of grunt job because you have to make sure everyone has their music, which good luck with that with a bunch of college guys. And then went to manager, went to tour manager, and planned and led a 150th anniversary tour across the country for us. That was like a 7-week tour that summer of 2008. Wow. And loved it and thought I was going to go into orchestra management. And then two things happened. One, after that big tour, which was between my junior and senior years, I decompressed afterwards because I'd spent basically 2 years of my life nonstop planning this thing. It was like
prepping and running it,
functionally a thesis. So I wanted a way to relax, and happened to apply for a fellowship and one that gave a stipend to travel to Italy. And it was covered your airfare and hotels, and you'd probably be able to make it a week there. And I realized I could really extend it I found a farm basically that would let you work on the farm in exchange for room and board. Yeah,
it's a pretty good trade-off.
Yeah, and it ended up being not just a farm, but a restored medieval castle in Tuscany that had their own vineyard.
Wow.
And I was just out in the vineyard every day for several weeks. I can't even remember what they had me doing, but hopefully nothing important. But, I got to stay longer in Italy, which was the real goal. But at the same time, I fell in love with wine, which hadn't been a thing.
And had you been a fan of, were you a fan of wine before?
No, I mean, I wasn't not a fan, but I was a really big microbrew beer person up until that point.
Sure.
And I think, honestly, a lot of that's just because, especially as a young person, that it was easier to get your hands on microbrew beers and try a variety of them. And frankly, yes, there's like the age thing in the US, but even more important is the cost to entry, right? Like you could try a ton of microbrew beers, especially if they're getting them from a bottle shop for, a couple dollars a bottle or something.
Yeah.
Yep. It's a much lower barrier to entry. So
than wine.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it wasn't on my radar, but it wasn't like I was opposed to it, I guess. And being there and seeing it as a part of everyday life, which was, is very Italian, I suppose, but that really resonated with me.
And are you at that point, you're clear that's what you want to do, or is there another, movement in the career, path before then?
Still another movement. I came back, had my senior year. I thought of it as just like a nice diversion, and I was going to get back to orchestra management. I was going down to New York City most weekends for seminars at the League of American Orchestras, had a bunch of really great connections into that world through Glee Club alumni, but then through stuff that I'd done on my own and a lot of interest in what I might want to do. But it's an incredibly important job. But the more I learned about it, the more I realized that in the sort of standard operation, being on the management side, especially in an orchestra, you actually almost end up in opposition to the art side. Not intentionally, but like it's your job to make sure the numbers all work.
Right.
And you're kind of in your own office doing that. And it's really important work to make sure these organizations can thrive and continue to do what they do. But
your passion is the music.
Yes.
Your passion was the performance, the impact that it has. And you're cut off from that in a back room, sending emails and creating schedules and budgets and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, in the Glee Club, I was managing it, but I was also rehearsing 3 times a week and singing in the concerts and was getting that artistic fulfillment. And the management side of orchestras, that's not really how it would work out. So there was, I don't want to say I was disillusioned, but at the same time, I was starting to waver on that. This wine bug was kind of, I just couldn't really forget what a great time I had, and learned more about wine. There was a professor who offered a wine seminar for his seniors in your spring. It was kind of like an after hours, you'd meet once a week. I think honestly, it was just an excuse for him to open up fun bottles that he wouldn't have an excuse to open up otherwise. Yeah. But I got into that seminar, and again, it wasn't for credit or anything by any means. It was just it was almost like a club. Right. But it's honestly probably the only class my entire time in college that I read everything for and got every book and because I was just, I guess that's a good sign. I got hooked.
Sure.
We still have a lot of those books on our shelves here. I've read the World Wine Atlas cover to cover and would try and memorize where all the vineyards were, which now seems quaint in retrospect. But
sure.
But that was it was such a fascinating topic to me. Graduated, hadn't pursued a job in orchestra management that seriously because I think again it was just how things were lining up. I did take a stab at a job that I thought might kind of thread the needle for me, which was an international touring position with Jazz at Lincoln Center, but they ended up going with an internal candidate at the end. And the same day I got that notice from them, I sent out a bunch of emails to Finger Lakes wineries, seeing if anyone wanted a local harvest intern.
So you're in that, you're reading everything you can. This professor, shines a light on something you had experienced. It clicks a little bit, and you decide, going home. Had you in those intervening years, had you sort of followed the rise of the Finger Lakes or seen how it was pivoting, or just, I know there's stuff at home and that seems like a good place to go see what I can do?
It was much more the latter, to be honest. It was, again, Finger Lakes did come up in that wine class, which is kind of remarkable in retrospect, but he was kind of oh no, we have this region that's local to us relatively local to Boston that is doing some interesting things. We would get to bring a bottle every once in a while and we would all taste it. And I went to, I think, the Whole Foods in Cambridge, and they had a Fox Run Chardonnay. And I picked it up because I was I should bring this, it's from where my home. And I brought that to the seminar and we tasted it and it showed nicely. But yeah, I didn't have the sort of maybe the way some people look at the Finger Lakes now, especially if they're in the wine world, which is a very calculated and correct, I would say, decision. Oh, this is a region where as a young person or a young entrepreneur, I can really, get a foothold and make a mark.
Sure.
I wasn't necessarily thinking of it that way. I kind of got here, came back home, had to get a driver's license because I didn't have one at that point. And really hard to work in the Finger Lakes without driving a car.
That's right.
And it was, as I was here, fortunately, I liked the wines we were making. I think that's the first thing. And then...
And Kelby, where are you firfirst? Where do you land first when you get back here?
Right at Fox Run. So very cosmically correct, I suppose.
Yeah.
I emailed, and I emailed a bunch of info at email addresses. And I didn't hear back from, I don't think I really heard back from many people at all, except it somehow ended up in Scott Osborne's hands at Fox Run, and he forwarded it to Peter Bell, the winemaker, and said, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And they were very open to having me come by. I think in retrospect, I now understand, I've had so many people who want to be interns over the years, and I mean, many good interns, but a lot of people who have no experience and say, "Oh, I'd like to get into wine." And they come for one day and you never see them again.
And they realize it's not for them.
Yeah, it's not a romantic job. And they still might find a different part of the wine industry that they end up in, but certainly not production.
Sure.
And I, maybe because I'd come up through the Glee Club and had this attitude of starting with stage managing and getting to go to the library and being handed a shovel and scooping grapes. I was okay, well, this is the next
just part of it.
Yeah, the next great part of it. And I just loved the work. Like I loved the physical side of it. I loved the, not that I was making any artistic decisions, but you can still, even in the first year, you're aware of like, wow, there are so many decisions being made with each wine, style decisions, different ways of handling it. Like this is an endlessly fascinating puzzle that
if I can right there, actually, Kel, because that's one of the things I sort of wanted to get to. There are so many facets to the business of winemaking, right? There's agriculture, there's being a biologist and a chemist, and you talked about nanotech before, right? So there's that side of your brain. Then there's the artistic, right? I have over my shoulder one of your lovely new rosés with a gorgeous label, and there's a story with that, I know. And then, making and producing it and marketing that wine. What are you most passionate? Is there a piece you're most passionate about? You talked about loving, shoveling grapes, and there are all those facets to this industry. What calls on you the most? Is it a combination of them?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I guess I'll answer in two ways. One is that I think my natural skill set is I got lucky that it is in wine production. I think I have a decent talent for a lot of the different aspects, but am really keyed in on how to make wine, kind of like both the physical side of it, the moving hoses and how to do that correctly and all those things, but also the sort of like memory bank of taste of like, oh, I see this, like this means we should do, Y to bring it to this point. But I think,
does that come through repetition, or is that some of that's just innate in a palate and, it's sort of the nature nurture side of it?
I think I don't think I'm a particularly innately great taster. I think that a lot of that was nurture. I think I'm a really good taster now. But I think anyone who enjoys food probably could, if you put your mind to it, could be equally as good at wine tasting. But then I think the part of the industry that, as I've been in it, actually intrigues me the most, or I enjoy the most, is maybe it's the full circle thing. It's connecting with people, especially connecting with people outside the Finger Lakes, and bringing these wines to them and bringing a piece of home to them, and seeing a region that, when I was growing up here was certainly a backwater, right? It was like people didn't want to move to Rochester in the 90s and early 2000s in particular.
That is correct.
And to have something to bring that, makes people's eyes light up, and to have that story to tell. I think that's the thing that time and time again, no matter how tired I am, I always have room to talk to someone for something like that.
So I want to come back to, your work at Red Newt and your own winery, and now the pivot to your new winery, which I'm so thrilled I've had the chance to taste a little bit, and it is exactly what I would hope for from you. But you've also been co-chair of FLXcursion. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, because that leverages what you're talking about of bringing the winery to other people, right, and the region to other people.
Yeah, it's a great event. It's an exhausting event. It was probably the best training for starting a business possible, running a conference of this magnitude. But its roots are actually in Seattle, because Chateau Saint Michel, huge West Coast, Washington-based Riesling producer, they would host a conference every 3 years called Riesling Rendezvous. And they rotated that conference, or they hosted that, and then there was a German version and an Australian version. So it was a 3-year cycle. And in 2010, the Seattle version came up. I think it was their second or third one ever. And I was lucky to be able to go with the Fox Run crew, and it was like an eye-opening experience. All these like great Rieslings from around the world, amazing wines, amazing people, right? You have all the producers there. It's like a wild collection. Great. Full stop. Came back around 3 years later. I went to it again. And by that time, I was there thinking, with no offense to Washington State, or certainly to Seattle. Well, one, Seattle's 5 hours away from where they grow the grapes. So it'd be like having a Finger Lakes conference in New York City.
Sure.
You're like, we're in the same state, but like, that's kind of a technicality. But it was like making me wonder, like, when could the Finger Lakes host an event like this? Like, it feel like the Finger Lakes internationally is where most people think the most exciting Rieslings in the U.S. come from. We don't make nearly as much as Washington State, but they're the wines that people get most excited for. It's kind of why wouldn't we host one? And that kind of like worked away in my brain for a few years. And it was on a plane to Chicago, I think, when I was seated next to Oscar Binke from Herman Weimer. And he and I were talking about doing some different events together, which we were actually on our way to Chicago for, as it were. And I pitched him on the idea of doing this Riesling conference in the Finger Lakes. And I was like, you know what, we should host an international Riesling conference here. Like, it would be a huge boost to the region's stature to pull it off. But we can only pull it off if we work together. And I had a bunch of connections at that point. Oscar and Herman Weimer, the winery Herman Weimer, but they had tons of connections. And it was kind of like the only way we can do this is if we bring ourselves together and bring a bunch of people along with us. This can't be a one-person job to do it well. And fortunately, maybe it was the altitude. He agreed that we should pursue it. And this, it's one of those things that like it gets a momentum of its own. And we started to plan it, started to reach out. We had a lot of good contacts in the wine world, of course, but journalists. And, you get really big journalists that want to come for an event and do a seminar, and then that journalist reaches out to producers, and they say, oh, well, if so-and-so is going to talk about the wine, like, I should probably be there in person, right? Like,
sure.
And at the same time, just as a huge quirk, Riesling Rendezvous, they decided to spin down because that was totally run by Chateau Saint Michel, and it got bought out by a hedge fund. And when they were looking at costs, all of a sudden, like,
one of the things that goes.
Yeah, it was a big boondoggle. It's like, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
So but the planning committee loved that event. The Riesling Rendezvous planning committee loved that event. We're very sad that it was getting kind of dismantled, and they handed over the dates that people had already saved for them for the next iteration. And we just kind of stepped right into that in 2019. And boy, it was a huge moment for the region. I don't think you can really overstate what having, downtown Geneva filled with some of the most important names in the Riesling world, both from the production side, the winery side, but also journalism, buyers, because it was a lot of sommeliers are coming up for the event because they see who's going to be there.
Sure.
Just a huge event not necessarily a lot of people. I think that first year we aimed for about 125 attendees, seminars all throughout the Finger Lakes. We really wanted to get people, rather than do it in a hotel room or conference room, I should say, we got people on buses and different wineries around the Finger Lakes
out into the region.
And we were lucky we found wineries that were willing to, on a summer day, close down for half a day and host a seminar because, so many people, the Finger Lakes has always been an incredibly collaborative region. And the sort of rising tide lifts all ships. And, people were really excited to help make this happen. So yeah, we did it in 2019.
I want to, that's amazing. You've done 2 since then, or 2 additional ones. So total of 3. I want to get to your winemaking and your new company in a second, but it does seem that is a hallmark of the Finger Lakes, is the collaboration among growers, producers. It seems to be a core component of what makes us unique. Is that true? Are we unique in the wine world? And how do we maintain that as we continue to, there's competition and the region grows and you get people who maybe aren't as invested. How do you maintain that? And are we unique in that way?
Well, you have asked a question I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about, because the Finger Lakes is unquestionably unique in that collaborative spirit. And yeah, it doesn't mean that everyone is always, it doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of internal competition and there aren't, people don't have different feelings, but overall, that belief that we can band together and do better for the region is really, it's distinct. And I think a lot of it is, in other wine regions, it's very common to have, you hear about spouses, kind of like Julia and I, that are winemakers for different companies, and they have to sign non-disclosure agreements to not share the proprietary secrets of one company to the other. And that just doesn't really happen here. I think it does go back to that Farm Winery Act in some ways that we talked about. I think when I look at how people interact historically in the Finger Lakes and to this day, it does make me think about the fact that it's small farmers that all had to kind of got thrown into this. It's not, and there is that sort of like farming community spirit of like, oh, we'll come together to help lift someone's barn, right? Like I think that's part of the DNA. But yeah, I'm a little curious how it's going to go as we have more and more outside investment and interest, and people who come in that haven't, either weren't from that initial spirit or maybe haven't been brought up through it because that's how you got into the industry here for a long time. So I'm not trying to like be a doomsayer by any means. I think it's such a strong ethos to the Finger Lakes, and through these sorts of events that we put on together, that carries through. But I think it's going to be something that recognizing it's special and recognizing we need to protect it the best we can is going to be the one way to make sure it sticks around.
Yeah, and that's great. And I know you are one of those people that's helping to expand and glue the community together. So that's great. Well, let's talk about your wine. You've got a new, grab it back here. You've got a new winery launched, Apollo Praise. How did you make the decision to go out on your own?
It's a great question. I mean, I've had a really great run at Red Newt, and part of that was working with a vineyard site called Lahoma, which is on the southwest side of Seneca Lake, just south of Glenora by about 2 miles. I feel like that's a good way marker for a lot of folks. And really loved that fruit, made my name with it in some ways. And kind of out of the blue, the grower, I called him or I texted him, because that's what growers like, texted him in August of 2022 and said, hey, do you have any Chardonnay this year? I got to work with a little bit last year, but I'd love to work with some if you have it again. And he called me back and he's like, oh, sorry, Kelby, I don't have any Chardonnay. It's a light year. It's all spoken for. Do you want to buy the farm? And it was that much of a non sequitur.
Yeah.
And my response was, well, I should probably talk to Julia, but I think the answer is yes. Because like, a vineyard site that and that is really good, like those don't really come on the market. Nor were we in a position necessarily that we could just like outright buy a gigantic vineyard. And we were fortunate that Ken Fulkerson was really, he believed strongly that we were the right people to take it to the next level and wanted to work with us to make that happen. So that was a real blessing. But even then, the thought was Julia was obviously at Hosmer, I was at Red Newt. We thought that was kind of how it was going to go. Ken offered to stay on as the farm manager for at least the first year. Like, all right, well, we could buy the farm, get a couple harvests under our belt. We'll be making money elsewhere, and then maybe look at launching a winery, because that was always in the back of our minds. And then, so we closed in April of 2023, and then anyone who is adjacent to the wine industry will know that the next line is that May 18th, we lost half the crop to the frost, which is, it's tough for anyone, obviously. It is especially tough when you haven't even made your first mortgage payment on the farm, right? Like you're in a really tight financial situation at that point. It's not like you have equity to lean back on so it kind of supercharged the timeline for launching our own winery. I stepped away from Red Newt and started working full-time in the vineyard, kind of learning as much as I could, doing as much as I could myself. And then at the same time, we got the things spun up basically for launching a winery. So the name, the one thing that we did have in advance was the name, because a few years prior, I was just like, I think I was driving to or from work, and it hit me kind of out of the blue. I was like, oh man, there's this song, Glorious Apollo, that is like the iconic song of the Glee Club. Everyone has sung it. And like one of the big lines in it is Apollo's praise. You're doing these things like looking for friends and unity and joy in the name of Apollo. And it just seemed like a great winery name, that kind of like summed up how we feel about wine, how we feel about it as a community builder, a place to bring people together and ideas together, but also that sort of artistic musical side. So I just kind of like memory banked it. I was like, all right, Apollo's Praise, like great winery name down the road.
Don't need it today, but I might need it at some point.
And, and
did you think you were going to do that though? At some point, was that in the cards? Like, yeah, at some point, 5 years, maybe longer down the road, we are going to make that jump, but it sort of presented itself, or, just sort of that's clue yard marker one that, this is a potential journey that's just taking place, with some inertia.
I think we thought it might happen at some point, but we hadn't put much thought into the when or how of it. So it was in our thought process somewhere. But yeah, this just kind of, it was just like, for the name was more of just like bullet board it, right? Like bulletin board it. Like,
sure.
If I ever need it, or maybe it's just the name of a wine down the road. But as it turned out, it was ready to go when it was time to say we were going to have our own winery.
That's pretty amazing. I don't know how you decipher these things. I tend to believe things happen for a reason, and there are clues along the way that help you get there. And part of that is your enlightenment. Part of it is, to be able to read the clues, but you also have to, as an entrepreneur, be willing to take that risk. What do you think goes into being a successful entrepreneur? What are the key ingredients?
I think my favorite saying recently has been, it's better to be lucky than good. But that the truth behind that is that luck is also a function of putting yourself in the right place and
doing the work, put yourself in the right place,
and being willing to recognize something and jump on it when it presents itself. That's a key part of luck as well. Because I think I love saying that, because we bought a vineyard and then lost half our crop in the first year. Like, well, to a lot of people, that would be the sign in the opposite direction, and not
you're right. What did we do?
Yeah, not an inspiration point to start a winery. But I mean, we wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, it's been a great opportunity ever since. So I think that, that putting yourself in the right place is the key thing, and being willing to jump at something when you see it. And then, boy, the same thing. I mean, I've said it time and time again throughout, I guess, my whole life, especially as I've reflected on things in life. But the reason I got into Harvard, and the reason I did well in the Glee Club, and the reason I did well in learning as an intern about winemaking, I've never felt like it was because I was preternaturally talented at something. I think most of the time it's because I've just been willing to work harder than anyone else.
100%.
Yeah.
I think that is such a core ingredient.
And, that's without a doubt, I mean, how I got into Harvard and how I got through Harvard, because I was just, a hard worker. There's people who had been afforded much greater opportunities than me beforehand to get there, or had family connections, or, all those resources. And, I got there because I was just willing to put my nose down and work hard. As it turns out, I think I had a much more enjoyable time at college than most of my classmates as well, just because I went there without, unfortunately for them, the sort of family pressure of, you're the sixth, generation to go. You're pre-med, there's a lot of unhappy people at Harvard, unfortunately.
You got there. Everything else was gravy. Yeah. Well, speaking of time, I want to be respectful of your time. It's a busy time. I want to ask two last questions, and they can be rapid fire as long as you want. So obviously this is an all-consuming job, launching your own company, but winemaking in general is just very intensive. So how do you stoke your personal passions? How do you, whether that's using it to decompress, what are those things you do, those passions you follow outside the all-consuming world of wine?
For me, it's a ton of music. Love, and all of the wines come with a song pairing that you can find on the tech sheets. And as we build out the website, it'll have it. And I think, especially hearing this story, you might have an expectation of what sort of songs the pairings will be, and you would be wrong probably, because it is all over the place.
I saw the Cab Franc. I saw the one on Cab Franc. They're definitely not what you think with the story we just told.
Yes, there are classical pairings, but there's jazz, there's plenty of rock and hip hop and R&B, and I think which speaks to how sort of omnivorous my music taste has always been. And I mix it up. I listen to a lot of music. I also am a big fan of a handful of different podcasts about music, just because it's really enriching to get, both more backstory behind music, but also sort of critical takes on music that kind of open up your own eyes to like, something you didn't listen to or hear the right way. And so I think that's a huge part of my, I mean, music's always playing, frankly. I have to be honest. It's just always the drive down to work, I'm usually listening to Jazz 90.1 out of Rochester, and then like listening to new music at work, listening to podcasts quite often at work, and then at home music's always on in the background. Anyone who's worked with me knows I like we would do themed days during harvest.
I like that.
So that we would, because I didn't want to be autocratic. I wanted, if I have interns and stuff coming in for harvest, so we'd establish themes. We had like Diva Friday, Jazz Saturday, and it's like, but someone could say, hey, I think the Diva we should listen to today's Prince. And I'd be like, great. And like, we just rock with Prince for the day. Yeah.
That's great.
So that's the main thing. And then the other thing that I do, although not as much the last year, thanks to how crazy life has been, but I'm always trying to do is cook. I've always loved cooking, which taps into a lot of the same things winemaking does, but
similar,
but in a different way. And frankly, a much faster. You find out if you succeed much faster with cooking a meal than with making a wine.
The incubation period's a little different. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I keep saying to people, I missed my calling. If I could do anything, it would be making soundtracks for movies. I'm the same. In fact, I have a playlist that I put out every month. I curate on Spotify and put it out there. I'm the same. Music's a core component. So my last question for you then is people are trying to find their passion, that purpose that they're getting up every day to really find and drive. What advice do you have for someone that's looking for their passion or deciding how to pursue it?
I think the main thing I would say, and because we see it a lot in the wine industry, we have a lot of people who, as I mentioned, come in and think they want to be in winemaking and then realize that it's not actually for them. And I think the big thing that I've always told folks is that don't be afraid to try something and for it not to work. I think we're so conditioned to think that like if you take a risk, it's only successful if it pans out. All right. And people, I think, lose track of the fact that taking a risk and trying something and realizing it's not for you, so long as you've learned from it, you haven't the risk paid off as well. The wine industry, tons of people who maybe aren't meant for production, but then end up as great, marketing people or wine club operators, or like there's, the world is much, when you have like a particular dream in mind that you want to explore, not one that like to your core is already correct for you. But when you want to explore a dream, it's important to remember that there are many versions of the dream that exist.
I love that. That is a perfect point to end it. Kelby James Russell with Apollo's Praise, available in restaurants and stores near you. Thrilled to have you on today. Thank you so much. This is the Walk On Podcast, people leading with passion and purpose, providing a roadmap for your personal journey. Hear their stories, find your passion, walk on. Kelby, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I was hanging